Hello, everybody. We'll take a seat real quick and we'll get started. Okay. Well, welcome again. We are again, this is our fifth meeting of 6 for the Jefferson Avenue Specific Plan Steering Committee meetings. We're going to follow the same format that we followed over the last few meetings. Got a lot to talk about tonight, plan administration. Let's handle some business real quick. We'll take roll call here. Committee member Carey. Committee member Kite. Hagel. Here. Yeomans. McCracken. And Hogan. Okay, great. Again, we're going to go through this as we have. We're going to be talking mostly about plan administration tonight as well as sign standards, and we'll stop at each section to discuss and have questions. And we'll have Katie and Dale come up and split the presentation in half. And we'll go ahead and get started right now with Katie. She's going to talk about plan administration.
All right. So first, before we talk about plan administration, just wanted to go through some of the key takeaways from the previous steering committee meeting. And so, as many of you probably remember, we talked about the multimodal mobility plan that's going to be included as part of the future Uptown Jefferson specific plan. And we talked about the existing and future vehicular network, the pedestrian network, bicycle and trail network, and transit network. And all of these items we talked about in light of the recommendations that came out of the visioning process and how we would meet the mobility goals for the specific plan area. So specifically to encourage the development of a multimodal interconnected circulation network that improves circulation for all modes of transportation. So cars, pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users. We also talked about and presented to you the draft parking standards that we came up with, and just wanted to reiterate again that the urban parking ratios are intended to be an incentive to encourage new development. And right now we are still looking at residential to provide 1 space per unit, commercial to provide 1 space for every 500 square feet. And really the intent behind this is to ensure that near-term development can occur with parking that can be surface as opposed to at grade, hopefully to allow for developers' projects to pencil out with the opportunity for them to provide at grade parking. And also wanted to reiterate that these standards are a minimum. So if a developer wanted to provide more parking spaces on their site, maybe for example they thought the market would require additional parking spaces, or a particular tenant that they were looking at would require additional parking spaces, that they would have the opportunity to do that. And we also wanted to reiterate that the on-street parking will also be available throughout the specific plan area to supplement the off-street parking that would be required. And after some of the comments that came back after last month's meeting, we are intending to reevaluate the parking ratios once development occurs and demand increases. And this is kind of similar to the approach that we took in Old Town. So as people were coming into Old Town and the parking demand was increasing as part of the specific plan amendment, we did do a parking study for Old Town. Any questions about that? Yes.
Question. It said down here at the last slide, similar to the Old Town approach. The Old Town approach has a parking structure. Is that in or out of the possibilities in this new?
When we did the parking study for Old Town, that was a recommendation that came out of that study. So I think for the Jefferson area, when we do the future parking analysis, that probably would be something that the city would look at as a potential down the road.
No decisions until that time?
Yes, correct. Any other questions? No? Okay, seeing none. So jumping into the plan administration. Just to reiterate, we are intending that the specific plan is going to allow for greater flexibility in land uses and development options. And this slide's probably familiar to many of you, that we intend that the plan will be market-driven, and that property owners will not be required to change the buildings or the uses on their property as a result of the specific plan, and they will be able to utilize the new specific plan document as a tool for new development on their property when the owner chooses to pursue such changes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the plan is going to be administered and implemented. And what we've come up with right now is what we're calling a phased code compliance, where we know that incremental revitalization is going to be happening within the specific plan area over the 30-year time frame. And right now, the specific plan is intended to allow for flexibility as development incrementally occurs through the implementation of the form-based code. And basically what this means is that the scope of a project will determine which specific plan code requirements a project proponent would be required to comply with. So to give you an example of what we mean by that, this is our draft specific plan compliance matrix. On the left-hand side, we have the scope of development proposal, and then listed underneath that a number of different thresholds that we're looking at. And then on the right-hand side, the specific plan compliance that's required based upon the scope of the development project or the threshold that's being met. So the first one, if a project proposes to change the exterior of an existing building, but they're not adding square footage, what we're proposing to do is that project would be required to comply with the architectural design guidelines of the specific plan only. If a project or an existing building wanted to add 10% or less of the existing square footage that's on a project site, that project would be required to comply with the architectural design guidelines and the signage standards only relative to that new addition. Jumping into the third item, building additions greater than 10% and up to 50% of the existing square footage on a project site. If and when that occurred, the project would be required to comply with the architectural design guidelines, signage standards, the building and frontage type standards, the building placement standards, maximum building height standards, parking placement, and minimum parking space requirements. And that would be relative to the new addition only. And then any project that would come in that would exceed either 50% of the existing square footage on a project site, or if the improvements exceeded 50% of the assessor's appraised value of the existing structure, then all of the code requirements would apply. And then, of course, if there was a project and a new development project was being proposed on the site, all the code requirements would apply. Any questions about that?
Does that also include sidewalks in an older building that's modified over 10 to 50? Don't have sidewalks in front of their properties. Will they be required to do it as it says on the?
If they're doing 10% or less, no. If they were doing between 10% and 50%, they would not in that case either. It would just be if they were exceeding that 50% threshold or if they were coming in with a brand new development project.
On your last category,
Sure.
refer to the value. Sure that I agree. You have somebody that's owned a building since 1977, this example, you have an appraised value that might be been allowed to go up in Prop 13, whereas you could come in and move the building and trigger 50%. Of course, I don't have any issue with the 50% of the square footage, but owing to the fact that the 50% is not a level playing field without, like, if I buy a building today, maybe it's $1 million. I have a building since 1977. I'll trigger it, I'll do the same improvement on a 100,000 building that trigger it. So, sure.
Okay. I think
So it's
that's,
something to think about, because it is, and there are some folks there that have owned the building.
for quite some time.
Top 13.
Okay. We'll take that into consideration. Anybody else? Okay. So moving along, this next part of the presentation, we're going to talk about minor exceptions, variances, and interpretations. So jumping into the minor exception, this is a planning application type that would allow for minor adjustments to certain requirements in the specific plan. And when it can be demonstrated that strict compliance is impractical or undesirable, and some examples that we came up with. So if somebody wanted to reduce the required lot size, the size of the setback, the number of parking spaces required on the site, or the landscape area by less than 15% of whatever the specific plan requires, they would be able to apply for a minor exception and achieve that goal. So it gives a little bit of flexibility in the development standards. And we are proposing that minor exceptions could be approved by the Director of Planning without a public hearing. And a variance is a planning application type which allows permission to an applicant to depart from the code when, because of special circumstances applicable to the actual characteristics of the property, that the strict application of the code deprives the property of privileges enjoyed by other property under identical zoning. And variances present unnecessary hardships that might result from the strict or literal interpretation of the certain code requirements. An example that we came up with was a reduction of the required lot size, size of the setback, parking requirement, or landscaping due to the unique characteristics of the site. And variances were proposing that they would require approval by the Planning Commission. And the third option that we've come up with is what we're calling an interpretation. And an interpretation is a ruling that would permit a practice that is not consistent with the specific plan requirements, but is justified by meeting the intent of the specific plan. And an interpretation can be approved if it better accomplishes the purpose and intent of the specific plan, but does not have an adverse impact on the public health, safety, and welfare, and meets the goals and objectives of the specific plan. And we're proposing that interpretations may be approved by the Director of Planning, so administratively without a hearing, but that the Director does have the discretion to request that the Planning Commission hear an interpretation at a public hearing. Any questions about that?
I don't agree with some of that at all.
Okay.
I know, it seems a lot, very general. And the last you said health and safety. Health and safety is involved in it. You're talking ADA, and you're talking in other areas that you don't, not too specific.
The interpretation a little
If I
bit.
could add to that, this proposal was actually fairly consistent in zoning codes, where you have, because the zoning code, as encyclopedic as you try to be, you're not going to touch on everything. So if there's an area where there's a gray area, short of having to go back to the Planning Commission and the City Council to get interpretation of the code, and it's not going to impact public health and safety. Now, if it's not in compliance with ADA, then it doesn't meet that requirement, because that is public health and safety and welfare. That's a kind of a general term that means dealing with, it has to comply with the building code, has to comply with accessibility standards. But if you, a good example would be a use. We have, in old codes, they tried to list every type of use that was known to man. But as we know, as times have changed, new uses have come up. And so now they have now we use more general categories. And as uses change, they may not fit into the general categories, but if somebody comes in and says, I want to do this type of business, it doesn't necessarily fall into that one category, but it's close to one or the other. Our code, like our development code, gives the planning director the ability to interpret that is a permitted use. And what we do here in Temecula is we do what's called an annual code update, where we actually, throughout the year, where if somebody comes in and wants to do something that it doesn't quite fit into what the code says, but it's not inconsistent with it, the director has the ability to make that interpretation. And it doesn't happen often. I'd say in the 7 years that I've been here, I've probably made less than a dozen interpretations. Been fairly minor. But what we do is annually we go in, and if it's something that we get repeatedly asked that, hey, you need to have something in your code that addresses this, amendment. But telling someone that, no, you can't do anything with the property, you can't lease this building out, because it doesn't necessarily, unless you do go back to the planning commission and city council to have them make that interpretation.
I wasn't talking about what the project was or what the use of. I was stuck in my mind, the sidewalk guy, is he revamps the building and it's upgraded, but still in front of his, and let's face it, this area, the majority of the area does not have sidewalks. Now, have you seen people out there in lunch hour, people getting exercises and hoofing back and forth? I watch them as I would wave by, but the point is that one of the problems that Temecula has is that we have old areas that haven't gotten up to the safe health areas. Now, I'm not saying that they need to go out and pay for it and this has to be done entirely, but something between the city and that says eventually you're going to have to. I remember the old town where it was gauche to have a sidewalk in front of your house. Things obviously changed. We have stop signs now that we didn't have back in those days. So yes, what you're saying is that we've gotten more modern and we've gotten more progressive. But if that's true what you're saying, safety and health is going to be among that. I don't have a problem with it.
Well, but the issue that you're talking about was really kind of addressed in the previous slide that talks about thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing more than 50% of an improvement to your building, either monetarily or square footage wise, you're going to have to meet all the standards in terms of
That's what I asked. That's what I
Yeah, this is a different
Okay.
section.
Well, I didn't know where it fit in there, but I knew it fit somewhere.
Patrick, I got a question for you. If you have a building and you have a tenant that exceeds 50%, going to do tenant improvements for that building right now. Not going up 3 or 4 stories, you're just going to fit that tenant in there. Vamping 50%, would that be considered a trigger?
Well,
I was doing
no, it wouldn't be because you're within the existing building.
It has to do with addition.
It has to do with
Correct.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Unless you're going in and doing improvements to the building that would trigger the, and very raised a good point, we need to figure out a different criteria than assessed valuation because for the very talk about. But if somebody were to go into a building and put in $1 million of improvements, that would trigger that because if it's more than 50% of the value of the building, then that would be an structure, and that's done through permit valuation. But if you're just going and doing standard tenant improvements for a retail or industrial user, that would not trigger the 50%.
Any other questions? No. Okay, so jumping into the permit processing procedures, this is our first shot at the different planning application types that could potentially be submitted to the city for review and the proposed review authority. And so as you can see, we are proposing that most all of the planning applications have the potential to be approved administratively through what we're calling a notice of intent to approve process, with the exception of a couple of different circumstances. For example, if you have a major modification to a building, a new development plan, or a conditional use permit with a development plan, these planning applications are not meeting the desired street and block size standards that we talked about at the previous meetings. In that case, that project would be required to go to the Planning Commission. And then if a building is going to be constructed above the target height or density, then in that case, it would also be required to go to the Planning Commission. So jumping into the notice of intent to approve and how projects will get approved under the new specific plan. The notice of intent to approve process, staff would mail a notice to all property owners within 600 feet of the subject project, indicating that the Director of Planning is intending to approve the project. The notice would be mailed 10 days prior to the effective date of the decision, and no public hearing would be required unless a hearing is requested by any member of the Planning Commission, the applicant, or an affected property owner that owns property within that 600-foot radius in response to the mailed notice. And if a hearing is requested, we would conduct it at the planning director level. And in addition to that, if the planning director does make a decision at the hearing, anyone can appeal that decision to the Planning Commission or to City Council if it gets that far in the appeal process. So when can a project be approved through a notice of intent to approve? So we have 3 different circumstances that must occur. The development project must be constructed at or below the target building height and/or residential density. The proposed project must comply with the block size standards, and the proposed project must construct the new streets and/or alleys in compliance with the block size standards. And when is a project going to require a public hearing? As I mentioned before, when a project or development is proposed at or below the target building height and or density, but does not meet the required block size standards, that project would be required to go to the Planning Commission for approval. And when a development project proposes to exceed the target building height and or density, it would be required to go to the Planning Commission for approval. And so when can a project be constructed above the target building height and or density? And so all of these conditions must occur. A project must meet or exceed the block size standards. The project must provide open space or public plazas as part of the project beyond the minimum required. The project must meet a minimum project size in acres. And again, when the project proposes to exceed the target building height and density, it would be going back to the Planning Commission. Any questions? Sure.
What is, I don't understand, project meets or exceeds the block size standards? And you're specifying a smaller block size.
If it's less than the maximum. It's a little bit confusing because it does say exceed.
Katie,
Yes.
is there any administrative, somebody's going to assemble several parcels, and let's say they're and parcels. Special process that, or does it just fall into the same kind of scenario, meaning if someone's gonna take down 10 or 15 acres and do a massive deal, pretty much follow this pathway, or would that be looked at differently?
We didn't look at that. We looked at the potential for projects or parcels to be assembled and then kind of correlated that with their ability to be able to go above the target height. So we didn't look at a minimum project size for an administrative approval process. Because we thought if somebody was assembling parcels, they probably would most likely like to go above and beyond the target height or density.
I mean, there is a way to deal, I mean, clearly, if someone marched into the city and said, hey, clearly there's a way to sit down with them and figure out it. I mean, And it might have different components that don't fit, but it might fall under the intent of the
Right.
specific plan. It just sounds like it would be, you have to look on a case-by-case basis, maybe.
Generally, it would fall under this scenario, but if it's a huge project like that, I think that, yeah, they're gonna look at it by case by case. Alleys and so many different. Some of them are case by case basis. Generally, yes, you're gonna fall into
Like if
this.
somebody came in, a huge tenant came in that was a national tenant. Yeah, it's,
Yeah, because right now, if they are able to meet that target building height, and then they're also installing streets pursuant to the block size standards, they would be able to be approved administratively. It's just that threshold of the building height that we were looking at that we thought, maybe planning commission discretion would be appropriate.
Well, if they're demolishing a building, actually, they would go to planning, wouldn't
It wouldn't. If
it?
the,
Facade, okay, with, the facade, to make it building, the height of the building, that,
well, looking,
Only based on the threshold.
this specific plan?
yes,
We're proposing, and that's kind of, it's an incentive, it's to incentivize development by making the entitlement process shorter. Because normally, if you have to go to the planning commission, it can take you 3 months. By meeting or longer, but if you agree to meet all the standards of the plan, then as kind of the quid pro quo is you then get administrative approval, because as part of the specific plan process, we have detailed development standard, detailed design guidelines that will be approved by the planning commission and the city council, which will say that, if you build to these standards, we'll allow you through the process faster. We're also doing what's called a program EIR, that if you build within the thresholds that are under the EIR, you not only go through administrative process, but your environmental is already cleared as well. So that is, you can shave quite a bit of time off the process. Now, the caveat to that is that if somebody in the area objects that it's administrative, it can be bumped up to the planning commission for a public hearing.
My only concern is the nice, lovely building off Winchester off-ramp, the odd colored and shaped building, I just don't want to see that happen again. Facade, and I think it's chuckles in most people in the area.
I'm not sure which building.
Right next to the freeway, north of Winchester, next to a paint store, odd building there that
Across the creek. Office building's got sort of the intricate. North of Santa Cruz Creek, and east of the bank.
Well, actually, yeah, a lot of folks like that building.
they do.
Yeah.
I'd like to meet at least one. I just find it, more eyes looking at it, the better I like it.
I tell everybody if they don't like it up in that area, it's in your area.
Good idea.
any other questions related to what we just covered? No? Okay, and seeing none, going to move along to our draft sign standards, and my colleague Dale will run you through that. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, we've taken a look at Old Town specific plan sign standards. We've looked at our municipal code. and a couple of other specific plans, and kind of put together then what we consider to be the appropriate sign standards for this Jefferson specific plan. Oops, that's it. Okay. So when do the new standards apply? New standards will apply when a site develops in compliance with the new development standards of the Uptown Jefferson specific plan. So as we covered in that compliance matrix, if you're just doing a facade improvement or changing of colors, sign standards don't apply, but once you start adding square footage, the new standards would apply to the new development. Okay? For existing developments, any new signs that are proposed as tenants change and/or adaptive reuse projects, it'll conform to the existing standards within the Temecula Municipal Code. Our list of prohibited signs is pretty typical to what we already have in our code. They do include detached banners, roof-mounted signs, with the exception of the Uptown Center, the Uptown Hotel and Tourist District, Uptown Sports, and the Creekside Village districts. That should also say on there I'm drawing a blank for the other type of sign. No, the type of sign. Marquee is also listed on there. Animated, rotating, moving signs, balloons, iridescent materials, ambient air balloons, can or cabinet signs, front-facing exposed bulbs, window and tenant signs above the second story, paper, cloth, plastic streamers, paper signs affixed to the inside of windows, exposed raceways, traffic sign replicas, and multiple repetitive use of words or symbols. And then any prohibited sign by the Temecula Municipal Code that's not expressly permitted by this specific plan would also be prohibited. It's fairly consistent with the municipal code, so you will see very little difference in those. Okay, these are the types of signs that we're considering allowing. Wall sign, blazed sign is the one in the middle there, hanging sign, which would be under a canopy, awning signs, portable signs, window signs, and then plaque signs, and then we have three more. Painted signs, roof signs, and the vertical marquee, and again, those are only allowed in certain districts. They are also, the roof sign and the vertical marquee sign are only allowed with a development plan and as part of a sign program. Okay, here's kind of a matrix of allowable sign types by the districts. Basically, most signs are allowed in most districts with the exception of the marquee is not allowed in the Wilder Hills and Creekside Village. The roof sign is not allowed in the Uptown Arts, Wilder Hills overlay, and Creekside Village. The painted wall sign is not allowed in, or actually wall and painted signs are not allowed in the Wilder Hills overlay. And then all the way over to the right column, temporary portable signs are also not allowed in the Wilder Hills overlay. So how much sign area is allowed and where? Each business may choose a combination of allowable sign types as long as the total combined square footage of each sign area does not exceed the maximum square footage of sign area for each frontage. So businesses having a single frontage on a public street are permitted one maximum of 1 square foot per linear foot of business frontage. Businesses having two frontages on 2 public streets are allowed 1 square foot of sign area per linear foot of business frontage for the primary street, and then a 1/2 square foot of sign area per linear foot of business frontage for the secondary street. And then those businesses that have freeway frontage are permitted an additional 1 square foot per linear foot of business frontage for the building facade that's facing the freeway. For the lighting standards, we're allowing internal illumination for wall signs, projecting signs, and hanging signs only. And then each tenant shall be permitted no more than 1 illuminated sign per street frontage. Remember, you can have a combination of signs depending on your square footage, but we're only allowing one per street frontage to be internally illuminated. And then externally illuminated signs shall be downlit fixtures. And for the draft public sign concepts, this is similar to what we've got in the Old Town specific plan, and no logo or design standards have been determined at this time, but we will be looking at gate weight signs, possibly median signs, public directory signs, and wayfinding signs, light pole banner signs, and then street name signage. And that is what we're proposed for sign standards.
Pull out signs that you put on the sidewalk.
Sure. The images? The portable sign? Mhm.
I missed that name. Is there a size, shape?
We will probably have standards on the maximum size, and they're also only allowed at the very front of a business. You're not allowed to put them down the street or out by the in the right of way. They'll have to be within what's considered the street frontage. Yeah.
And the signs, the measurements of them also go with the square foot?
No, those are in addition to. Yeah.
Is there any,
If there is, if you're ADA, they cannot be placed in the path of travel. Yeah, that's correct. In fact, we'll make note of that because I don't believe that's, it would be required by our, I would imagine our building and safety code, but we'll make note of that in the specific plan as well.
I was down by Vista a couple of weeks. Sign that I swear was 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. And I thought, formula what size and shape it can be.
It'll be height and width.
The Old Town plan is 2 by 3. So we can still with that.
Other ones, you don't have a, they're not allowed, are the other ones in Old Town?
Only Old Town.
Right, yeah, so,
how does this new sign criteria relate to the existing? What, are we diminishing the amount of space per building?
No, actually, it's very consistent. We typically do 1 square foot per linear foot of business frontage. And we don't allow for roof sign or marquee signs or portable signs. So we're actually increasing the type of signs that's allowed. And in terms of the size of the signs, it's the same.
You have an existing for your building with the city, and you're not build your building, you're just going forward until there's time that you make. Is that the guideline that you can use still, or do we have to do a new building sign criteria?
No,
I'm-
for existing development, it's going to be, it refers back to the Temecula Municipal Code. Now, if you do have a sign program, an existing sign program, you would still continue to follow that until such
Whatever
time.
design it is,
Yes.
The code, it's the same thing, so to speak.
Yes.
Great, okay.
Yeah.
The same thing too, if you do a sign program for a large-scale development, you can actually, through the approval of a sign program, you can actually exceed what the specific plan.
Yeah. Okay, yes.
On buildings that have alleyways, are you consider sign?
We will allow, it wasn't in here, we'll allow for a plaque sign or a blade sign on the back entrance of the building, but not within the public right-of-way, not within an alley. We do have that in Old Town as well, don't we? Yeah.
It's a no fee permit.
Yeah. Any other questions on signs?
enforce the ones that are, all the illegal ones that are out there today.
Yes.
I'll send you pictures.
Okay. Okay. That's all for the plan administration and sign standards for tonight. So just recap quickly the project schedule. We have one more steering committee and a meeting coming up in December. It'll be December 12th. The draft specific plan and EIR are anticipated to be ready in late December, with going forward to the Planning Commission in late February, and then on to City Council with approval of the specific plan and adoption of the EIR in late March. The steering committee schedule, again, we've already had the first 5 there, and December 12th is the next one, and we'll be discussing urban design guidelines, infrastructure, plan financing, and then our next steps. And as a reminder, the project website, www.envisionjefferson.org, is a place to access the past steering committee meetings and the PowerPoint presentations, and to get additional information. So please share that information with others if you have a chance. And with that, we are done unless you have any other questions. No? Okay.
Everyone have a nice Thanksgiving.
Thank you very much.